We have compiled the history of Izmir, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, for you. According to rumors, Alexander the Great, who went to Anatolia to fight against the Persians in 334 B.C. and advanced to Ephesus, recommended the establishment of a new city here, after a dream he had while resting while hunting in Pagus. Antigones, who dominated western Anatolia after Alexander, attempted to establish today's Izmir on the outskirts of Kadifakale and settle the people, but he lost his life in the war he fought with Lysimachos of Thracian in 302 BC, so the city was captured by Lysimachos. Lysimachos, who received help from Athens, carried out the project initiated by Antigones. During this period, Smyrna was quite advanced in terms of both trade and culture. It has truly become a cultural center with schools, hospitals, baths, gymnasiums and theaters. Palemon, who was a proconsul during the reign of Emperor Hadrian in the Roman age, received help from the emperor for the city. Buildings such as Hadrian's Temple, Gymnasium, and Wheat Market were built, and tax exemption was granted. Among the structures built in Izmir during the Roman period, very few traces remain of both the ancient theatre on the northwest skirt of Kadifakale and the stadium on the west. On the other hand, the Agora of Smyrna is very well preserved and is known today as the Agora for short. The Agora was rebuilt with the support of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius after the earthquake in 178 AD. Smyrna in the Middle Ages. When the Roman Empire was divided into two in 395, Izmir became a part of the Eastern Roman Empire, which would be known as the Byzantine Empire in the modern era. During the Eastern Roman Empire, the Umayyads, Seljuks, Crusaders, and Genoese fought each other to seize the city. The Umayyads first captured the city from the sea in 672 and used it as a base for their raids on Istanbul. The Turks, on the other hand, captured Izmir under the command of Kaka Bey, who was one of the Seljuk raiders in 1081 and became the first Turkish sailor in time. Departing from Izmir, the Byzantines took the city back in 1098 after the death of Kaka Bey, who terrorized the Byzantines with his raids on the Aegean Islands and the Dardanelles. In 1204, the coastal side of the city fell into the hands of the Knights of Rhodes. The region where Izmir is located came under the control of Adinogulari Principality, one of the Turkmen principalities established in western Anatolia at the end of the 13th century. Adinoglu Mehmed Bey captured Izmir Upper Castle in 1310 or 1317. His son Adinoglu Umur Bey made his first war on Izmir. After 2.5 years of siege, in 1328 the inhabitants of the city were compelled to surrender the port fort. The castle commander Martino Zaccaria went to Chios. The continuation of Umur Bey's campaigns in the following years led the Latins to apply to the Pope to organize a crusade against Umur Bey. The navy, consisting of Cyprus, Venice, Genoa and Rhodes ships, defeated the Adinogulari forces and succeeded in taking coastal Izmir from the Turks on 28 October 1344. After the attack of Umur Bey against Imbros in May 1347, especially the Rhodes Knights who had commercial interests in Izmir, the parties tended to an agreement. Although the Latins agreed to leave the city by demolishing the fortifications of coastal Izmir in return for some commercial concessions to be given by the Turks, Pope Clement did not approve of this, and Umur Bey took action to take coastal Izmir by fighting. Sews were dug and ditches filled while the castle was beaten continuously with catapults. However, the death of Umur Bey by an arrow hit in March 1348 caused the soldiers' morale to deteriorate and to withdraw to Izmir. Hizir Bey, who replaced Umur Bey, made an agreement that gave very wide privileges to the Latins. Thus, coastal Izmir remained under Latin domination for half a century. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire established dominance over Aydın province in 1390. After taking the throne, Yildirim Bayezid adds Adinogulari to his country along with other principalities against him, but the coastal Izmir remains in the hands of the Hospitalier Knights. The Timurid Empire army commanded by Timur, who had defeated the Ottoman Empire by winning the Battle of Ankara, took the city from the Hospitaller Knights as a result of the Izmir siege in December 1402 and destroyed the St. Peter's Castle. After Celebi Mehmed seized the throne and ensured stability, The Ottoman Empire annexed Izmir to the Ottoman lands in 1415, after a 10-day siege with the help of Christian lords such as the Rhodes Knights and the Prince of Lesbos. Some privileges were given to the subjects of the aforementioned states due to their assistance. Aydin Bey Cunayd Bey, who was imprisoned in Byzantium during these events, got out of prison after Celebi Mehmed's death and got involved in Düzmis Mustafa incident and captured Izmir again, but too. Murad captured the city definitively in 1424. From this date on, Izmir remained under the absolute Ottoman rule until it was occupied by the Greeks in 1919. The first discovery of Old Izmir was made by Suryako Diankana, who visited it in 1429–1430 and 1446. Ottoman Empire period. After Izmir passed under the rule of the Ottomans, it became the center of a district connected to the Aydin Sanjak. The district included Karşıyaka in the north, Bornova and Buca in the east, Torbali in the south, Çeşme, Seferihisar and Karaboran in the west, and its center was the city of Izmir, the residence of the Izmir judge. Izmir, which was initially attached to the Aydin Sanjak, joined the Sigla Sanjak, which was included in the Kaptanpasa province, in about 1573. Due to the fact that the sea side was in the hands of the Christians and the land side was in the hands of the Muslims in the Middle Ages, the city remained economically dull, and after it was completely taken over by the Ottomans, it showed great development only from the 17th century. Until the end of the 16th century, it was seen as a port that supplied goods to Istanbul in the domestic market. At that time, the city was self-sufficient in terms of the products grown in the fields, vineyards and gardens around it. Foodstuffs such as grapes, figs, pomegranates, almonds, pears, cherries, and necessities such as soap and beeswax, as well as rope, hemp, sailcloth, olive oil, etc., which the shipyard and İstanbul Amire needed, were supplied to Istanbul in the palace. Materials were supplied from around Izmir in the 16th century and shipped from Izmir by sea. Izmir witnessed the Arab Said and Kalenderoglu uprisings within the scope of the Selali revolts in 1605–1606. However, the city gradually became one of the most important trade centers of the empire after the capitulations granted to foreigners by the Ottoman Empire in 1620, and it showed a great economic development starting from the 17th century. Izmir port has become the most important center of domestic, foreign and transit trade in a short time. In the 16th century, the ships that were most visible in Izmir port were Venetian, Genoese and Dubrovnik flagged. Later, French and British ships joined them. These states did not have consulates in Izmir until the beginning of the 17th century. Consulates began to be opened after 1610. Meanwhile, the population structure of the city begins to change. 16th century sources state that there were 19 mosques, 18 synagogues and only one Greek Orthodox church in Izmir, and Christians lived in only one of the 9 districts of the city. Therefore, at that time, Muslim Turks were in the majority in the city center, there was an important and well-established Jewish community, and Christian Greeks must have been in the minority. Port City Izmir. Evliya Çelebi also records the first observations of the change in the population structure during his visit to Izmir in 1672 and wrote that an increasing number of local non-Muslims, Levantines and Western merchants are concentrated in the Alsancak district. Foreign trade has also intensified since these dates. Izmir was the last stop of the caravans coming from Anatolia. Caravans came and went from January to October. Iranian silk, which went to Europe by way of Aleppo Iskenderun until the 17th century, changed direction in the second half of this century and came to Izmir via Erzurum Tokat and started to be shipped to Europe from there. According to Tournefort, at the beginning of the 18th century, 2,000 bales of Persian silk were brought to Izmir annually, and these silks were purchased by English and French merchants on a large scale. The silk exports of the British Levant Company from some eastern Mediterranean ports, especially Izmir, in 1713, approached £500,000. Ankara and Bipazari mohair, which are in great demand by Europeans, Bursa silk, forest products of Antalya and cotton of the Aegean, carpets of Uzuk, opium, acorns and the products of Izmir and its surroundings, especially grapes and figs, are exported from Izmir. Was being done. While Izmir was in the second place after Istanbul in the second half of the 18th century in French woolen fabric imports, it took the first place after leaving Istanbul behind 30 and 40 years. Has maintained its dominance. In the 19th century, the city was a favorite of French, English, Dutch and Italian merchants. Parallel to this development, the center of Aydın province was transferred to Izmir temporarily in 1841 and then definitively in 1850. In the same year, Sultan Abdülmecid came to visit Izmir. When the increasing trade volume due to the conditions of the century necessitated the construction of a safer and faster railway, an English merchant named Robert Wilkin, who lived in Izmir in July 1855, requested a concession for the Izmir-Aydın Railway on behalf of himself and his 4 partners. In May 1857, a company named Ottoman Railway Company was established from Izmir to Aydın, and the plan of the line to be completed in 3 phases was redrawn. The first section of the line, between Alsancak and Seydiköy, was put into service on 30 October 1858. This line was the second railway line after the Alexandria-Cairo railway line, which was the first in Anatolia, within the borders of the Ottoman Empire, and was put into service in the province of Egypt in 1856. Izmir-Aydın was opened on June 7, 1866. In the following years, the Kasaba line was extended to Bandırma and the Aydın line to Sok. Thus, Izmir was connected to the most productive region around it by rail. After Sultan Abdülmecid's visit in 1850, Sultan Abdulaziz came to visit Izmir in 1863. The modern municipality organization in Ottoman cities started with the provincial regulation dated 8 October 1864 during the reign of Sultan Abdulaziz, and following this, Yunizherlizade Ahmet Efendi was the first president of the municipality established in Izmir in 1871. After the construction of the Aydın-Izmir Railway began, when it became clear that Izmir desperately needed a pier, it was considered in 1862 to build a cordon on piles that would provide speed and ease in loading and unloading of ships, and would also prevent smuggling from the back doors of the houses of foreigners living along the promenade. This idea later turned into a 4,723 cubit long quay between Konak and Alsancak. The dock, which was built by the French contractor Dassault Brothers, was completed and put into service at the beginning of 1876. 12% to be allocated as government share from the dock painting was left to Izmir municipality. In the 1880s, transportation between the two sides of the bay was carried out informally. On July 13, 1883, a concession was given to Yahya Hayati Efendi, one of the merchants, for a period of 30 years. Izmir Hamidiye Ferry Company started its voyages in February 1884. Izmir Hamidiye Ferry Company ferries used to go as far as Foça and Karaboran in the Gulf, and as far as Ayvalık and roads outside the Gulf, apart from the daily voyages inside the port. Over time, the company shares passed into the hands of foreigners. During the 19th century, Izmir was always ahead of other Ottoman ports in the Aegean and Mediterranean in terms of trade volume. Beirut and Thessaloniki, the 2 most important ports of the eastern Mediterranean, could not reach even 40% of Izmir's foreign trade in the 1880s. In the second half of the 19th century, Izmir's exports never fell below £3 million. In 1904 and 1905, it increased to over 5 million. Imports amounted to around 2 to 3 million. In the 19th century, the ship traffic in Izmir port followed an increasing course. While 1295 ships of 448,807 tons entered the port in 1863, the total tonnage of 2,495 ships entering the port in 1895 was 1,814,486 due to the increasing number of steamships. Modern era. After the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, the victors intended for a time to divide a large part of Anatolia into their spheres of influence and, in accordance with the Treaty of Sèvres, presented the western parts of Turkey to Greece. The city is occupied by the Greek army on 15 May 1919. From the very first days of the Greek army's landing, the first bullet, fired at the Greek detachments by journalist Hasan Tahsin and the killing of Colonel Fethi Bey and his unarmed soldiers with bayonets in the city's historical barracks became the symbol of resistance. references are made to numerous atrocities that took place for reasons such as the Yellow Barracks' refusal to shout, Zito o Venizelos. However, the Greek campaign against central Anatolia ended in disaster for both Greece and the local Greeks of Anatolia. The occupation ended with the Turkish army entering Izmir on September 9, 1922. Events such as the lynching of the Orthodox Metropolitan Chrysostomos Kallifatis after the recapture of the city on September 9, 1922, and the massacre of Armenian and Greek men who were then sent to the so-called working battalions, were followed by perhaps the greatest disaster in the history of the city. The fire, which started in the Basmain district on the morning of September 13, 1922, destroyed more than 20,000 houses and workplaces in an area of 2,600,000 square meters and lasted until September 22. Unfortunately, this fire destroyed 3/4 of the traditional area of the city. Today, Culture Park is located in a part of the fire area. The fire completely destroyed the Greek and Armenian quarters, while the Muslim and Jewish quarters escaped damage. Estimated Greek and Armenian deaths from the fire ranged from 10,000 to 100,000. About 50,000 to 400,000 Greek and Armenian refugees blocked the coast to escape the fire and were forced to stay there under severe conditions for about 2 weeks. The systematic evacuation of the Greeks at the dock began on September 24, when the first Greek ships entered the port under the watchful eye of the Allies. In total, between 150,000 and 200,000 Greeks were evacuated. The remaining Greeks left for Greece in 1923 as part of the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, a condition of the Treaty of Lausanne that officially ended the Greco-Turkish War. Thus, Izmir was completely freed from the Greek population. In 1923, a few months before the proclamation of the Republic, it hosted the Izmir Economy Congress, a congress where the economic problems of the new Turkey were discussed. The city was gradually rebuilt after the proclamation of the Turkish Republic in 1923. The bay to the east of the Kızılkulu Delta, which is moving to the north in Alsancak, is now equipped with the commercial port of Izmir and its affiliated facilities. In the western half of the delta, a few parallel chords stretching between Alsancak and Konak Square form the liveliest part of Izmir. The fact that not only the products coming from the Aegean Plains, but also the central West Anatolia, the Lakes region and the neighboring parts of central Anatolia send their export goods to Izmir, makes Izmir an export port that holds about half of Turkey's exports. The abundance of labor force and the consumption factor of the big city also stimulated the development of the industry in Izmir. Thus, Izmir has become the second important trade port and second industrial center of Turkey after Istanbul. The Izmir Fair, which was established in 1936 and opened in Culture Park every year and was the only international fair of Turkey until recent years, had a great impact on the increase in the trade efficiency of the city of Izmir. Tobacco, cotton, raisins, figs, bonito, licorice, opium, legumes, grains, olive oil, carpets, raw metals take the first place among the exports of Izmir port. Although there is a constant liveliness in Izmir port, this vitality reaches its highest level in a few months following the end of summer. Izmir gained the title of metropolitan city together with Istanbul and Ankara as a result of the law numbered 2972 and the decree law numbered 195 enacted in 1984. With the law No. 3030 enacted in the same year, the status of metropolitan and district municipalities became clear. Initially, 3 districts, namely Bornova, Karşıyaka and Konak, were included within the boundaries of Izmir Metropolitan Municipality. With the law numbered 5216 enacted in 2004, the borders of the Metropolitan Municipality were expanded to the borders of the circle with a radius of 50 kilometers by accepting the governor's office as the center. 21 districts within these borders became metropolitan district municipalities. With the law numbered 6360 enacted in 2012, the boundaries of the metropolitan municipality became the provincial administrative boundaries after the 2014 Turkish local elections.